Okay, so as I was saying, welcome everyone to this API ThreatStats webinar. This will be our annual review, so we're looking back at the entirety of 2023. If you've attended one of these in the past, it's possible that you attended one of our quarterly webinars where we were looking at a quarter's worth of data. So this will be a whole year's worth of data. I'm joined by Ivan Novikov, who's the CEO and founder of Wallarm and is deeply involved in a lot of this data, so he's got a lot to add. And we'll be going through our details. I'll give folks just another minute or two to join so that some of the latecomers can join us. Just a bit of housekeeping. This is a recorded session, so we can share the recording after the fact. Of course, we are also broadcasting it on LinkedIn. So one of the beauties of broadcasting it on LinkedIn is that it's always there to come back to and watch again. So if you want to see the data again, you can do that. All right. So thanks for joining us, everyone. I'll give folks one more minute to join us. And if you do want up-to-date information about Wallarm, LinkedIn is a great way to find it. So if you follow us on LinkedIn, you can get the alerts on API threats. You can get API security news, other information about Wallarm and API security in general as well. So a great way to keep in touch with us. And with that, I think we'll get started with the webinar. So this is what we're planning on covering today. We'll be talking a little bit about what the API ThreatStats is as a research project, just to give you some information about what you're actually looking at in terms of data collection and methodology. We'll talk about the Wallarm API Security Top 10, dive into some of the key findings from 2023, and then take a look forward at API security predictions for 2024 and a little bit of how Wallarm can help with API security as well. So with that, let's get started. To start off, just some context about what API ThreatStats is. This is an ongoing research project that Wallarm has undertaken for a number of years now, focused on performing data-driven analysis about the API threat environment. It's important to understand that what we're looking at here is real data. This isn't a survey. It's not opinion. We're taking a look at all of the CVEs and bug bounty reports, real world attacks and vulnerabilities, and then we're performing analysis on that data using both experts like Ivan as an example, but also AI insights and pulling in some opinion as well. So a data-driven research project that we do continuously and update. In terms of the data funnel, we pull data obviously from our own product, Wallarm, and there are billions of data points there around API attacks that we pull in, but we also pull data from the industry as a whole. So any API-related security bulletins we pull into this research as well. So things like CVEs are pulled in, vendor bulletins are pulled in. There are thousands of those. We also started last year looking at bug bounty reports, and there are hundreds of those. And the bug bounty analysis, I think, is one of the more interesting parts of the report. So we'll talk about that in the deck as well. And then we look at actual API exploits and perform analysis there. And in that case, there are also hundreds of those exploits for us to analyze. So there's a really strong and deep data funnel behind the research that we're producing here and the conclusions that we're coming to. So in terms of methodology, not overly complex, but I did want to represent a little bit about what we do. It starts with data collection, both automated and manual data collection from all of those sources that we just talked about. Some of them are Wallarm proprietary sources, some of them are public sources. We perform filtering and normalization on that data. And specifically, we're really filtering for API-related data. So obviously, there are lots of vulnerabilities, as an example, that get published in a given year. Some of them are API related, some of them aren't. We want to filter out the ones that aren't API related so we can focus on API issues specifically. We also, in that process, normalize a lot of that data so that we can perform analysis on it. Then we classify and analyze the results using both AI and manual methods to do that. And that's how we end up assembling the final report. The reason behind it, and I do think the reason behind doing this research is valuable. The reason we do this research, there are three of them in this case. First of all, this kind of research from an on an ongoing basis helps us gain real-time data, real-time analysis of API attacks and threats. That's important for us as a API security company to have that information to provide it to our customers through the product. And we use it to constantly update Wallarm's detection capabilities. We also use it to improve and extend the API risk models that we use internally and build into the product, and that we use in order to decide what product features we should build. So this research, while we think it's hugely valuable in and of itself, we like to share it with the community. It's done in order for us to deliver a better, higher quality, more valuable product to customers as well. So with that, that's the conclusion of the methodology section and the what is API threat stats. We're going to move on to the Wallarm API Security Top 10, which is really a dynamic list of API threats. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ivan to talk through the next couple of slides.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, so the first thing that I have to get covered as the Wallarm 2023 top 10 list. As you can see, it's quite different, and we do have a mapping to OWASP API security and also OWASP top 10. There's two OWASP quite different. First of all, because they targeted different things, and second, because one made in 2021 and second one 2023. So, and then ultimately, when we took in the OWASP API 2023, we have to count that it was issued at the end of 2022 year, right? And then it only include data for the last 4 years, and it exclude data of 2023. So our report include only data that we attributed as 2023. So basically our data, regardless of the name of this, right? And then it's essentially point of different data. The data we analyzed was completely excluded out of OWASP API Security 2023 because we included only 2023 data. And then we built a top 10 list, but mainly based by CWE categorization. So what we did, we analyzed these things and we actually finding out how to attribute every single vulnerability or bug bounty report, like all the data sources we got analyzed, we attributed to CWE. And after that, we try to group CWEs using, first of all, using the basic statistics, and then by using ChatGPT-4 to help us to build right groups and keep this to just 10 of them to be somehow aligned with overall OWASP top 10 idea, and also get the full coverage, means 99.9%. So what we did then, we got this 10 classes. It's an injections, number one, then authentication flows, and then cross-site issues. And then it's not related to cross-site scripting, for instance, but more complex cross-site API threats where we do have this browser as a client. As you know, many of these APIs designed to be used by browsers as their clients, right? Like single page apps, for instance. Then we do have a threat, which is quite interesting, number 4, called API leaks. And a bit later, we'll discuss that in depth. Then broken access controls and authorization flow. And authorization issues just quite different in terms of like broken access control. It usually looks like the same, but the ChatGPT suggested to split it by 2 categories and exclude basically access control, like role-based access control or whatever, attributes access control, whatever access control you have, among all this other authorization issues, right? And then insecure resource consumption, very, 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 very similar what was there for a while in OWASP, and also weak secrets and cryptography, which is, as it for me, probably the most, the first and the only well-known API security bug, right? Like you have a key or API secret, which is weak, right? And then session and password management, definitely APIs mainly, like a lot of them still rely on sessions or used to manage sessions, right? Regardless of this API and then that definitely will be there. NSSRF, which is well aligned to OWASP, and here we have a like a mapping. But what's most interesting for me as a researcher here, and I'm only talking as a researcher now, is this list, and Tim mentioned it before, built in a real-time manner. So for us, it allowed to see the threat in dynamic, and it allows us to rebalance our efforts and focus on what we have to focus on. And the next slide you will get how this top 10 things actually progressed during a year. And if you can see here on the left, we started Q1 with the cross-site things as a number 1, and then it go down and went to the second, third, and fourth row, and finally end up with a number 3 overall during the year, right? And injections went from 2 to basically top 1, and then it ended up with a number 1. And if you look at API leaks specifically, and a bit later we will discuss what was included in the class, it's basically started with a position number 6, and then it get 5, and then 4, and then 3, and end up with number 4 as the average between everything there. And it's quite interesting results, because once we got this second to first quarter progress of these issues, we start to design a product that detect and protect and manage such kind of issues and things like leaks, because the threat was obvious, right? And then we're doing a lot to basically try to not only attribute data and attribute threats to risk and help to score them, but also predict to where the threat goes. And a bit later, we will also touch some interesting idea how we can do that. Basically predict EPSS or other metrics using the Google as a database, basically. So, and then here also can find out like the dynamic of the list. What's very interesting here is some of this discoveries, like SSRF, for instance, well aligned with the classic OWASP built back in 2021. It means that the threat is like consistent and it's consistent and is their place. Some of them, including, let's say, injections, right? It took point number 1, and if you take a look at the previous OWASP, you always will see injections on the top. So injections definitely our main problem, and you can find out that injection hidden APIs very heavily, and then Log4j and other third-party libraries, and then middleware is definitely a good example here. But quite interesting that we do have basically some kind of like result that we were not able to predict, specifically session and password management and API leaks. So we have to basically accept that many of these APIs that we analyze and APIs that actually exist in the real world, because I assume that we analyze, we do have kind of like good representation by analyzing CVEs, right? The API is designed to proceed web data and get the web running, right? And the session and password management there is one of the core features, right? So basically, if you deliver a single page app, most likely you will have some session and password. So that's why this was quite interesting to me, that we finally end up with a list that makes sense and also aligned with CVEs, supported by the data, and categorized by classes, many of them well aligned with OWASP. Now to the next slide.
I think this is my favorite slide in the whole deck, actually. I just, the ability to see how the categories changed over time makes a huge difference, as you pointed out, Ivan. So I think it's one of the, I'm excited to see this visualization after another year and see how it's changed over sort of a 2-year time frame as well.
Yeah, and you know what? I probably, if you can get back for a quick, I guess,
yeah.
We also, next year, we also can like try to, let's say, make the lines, now it's a different, it's all equal widths, right? But in fact, we do have different amount of these issues. But when we score, we focus on amount of issues multiplied by an average CVSS score, right? To avoid cases like XSS or some CSRF attacks where we have many of them, but the risk score is low. So basically, we get this weighted analysis based on CVSS multiplied by the amount of issues to get this done. Next slide.
All right. So some conclusions from the dynamic top 10 that we've put together.
Okay, so so we actually find out a few very interesting things that basically disaligned with the OWASP API security top 10 and well aligned with the classic OWASP. And then the first thing is, yes, the injection threat number 1, no matter what, it's basically, as we discussed last time, legends never dies. So that's exactly the case with injections. It's easy thing to do. It's easy thing to test, well-known threat, so many of them, 25 or like 30 different types of subclasses of injections exist. And every single time when we have a new issues, let's say, what the most, it's a good question for you, Tim. What the most recent exploit you aware just a few days ago?
Oh, well, so there's a right answer, but I don't know that I have the right answer. So let's see. I can think of obviously the 23andMe is a recent one. There was a credential stuffing issue with an Australian retailer called The Iconic. What are you thinking of?
I mean CVE that just like strike get a strike like a few days ago. I mean Confluence, right? The
Oh,
Confluence
the Confluence one. Of course, we just published an update for it. Sure.
what OGNL injection, right? Who
Yeah.
knows what OGNL, right? It's their internal parser, but it's an injection, and now, I mean, it's hard and it's completely API stuff, right? So you bypass authentication, you find out an endpoint that's not protected, and you send this OGNL, and OGNL starts, and when the API starts to parse this OGNL before it check your authentication and get you authorized or not. So that's the thing. So, and all the time when we see cases like that, like look for shell, spring for shell, or whatever. I mean, my bet is like if it's like wide scale or image strategic before, right? If it's wide scale and high risk, all and the 99% injection, right? Very rare it's logic because like all the logic with all this API is different, right? And all the libraries that precedes data basically precedes data, right? And then that's why injection number one. The other thing is authentication at all. So we actually definitely find out that we call it AAA, authentication, authorization, and access control. And then it's basically split in this group by three. It's very unique. And then usually it's just like access control or authorization and then authentication. But ChatGPT suggested to split it by three, and I kind of agree with that because we can point specifically as it comes to development, we can point developers to what to do with this authorization. We can tell, hey, you do have role-based access control or attribute access control, whatever access control you have. Focus on this first. It's a threat number one. You do have a higher chance to make mistakes there, and then you can find out authorization in functions, authorization on object, authorization on whatever you have, and it's a bit different thing. And another thing, which is very controversial sometimes, so I know that many researchers will not, let's say, agree with me in terms of the cross-site stuff. First of all, when we tell here, when we covering here cross-site, it's not cross-site scripting attacks only. It's more about, let's say, reused all state, right, which is all CSRF stuff related to specifically APIs or tokens hijacking or WebSocket hijacking, right? Things that usually out of scope of usual cross-site scripting attacks, but they are still there. And I agree that cross-site scripting attacks only valuable and only impactful and only reasonable, right, and make sense only for APIs with a web or mobile apps as their clients, which is still the case. And it's specifically about this. However, we do have many of the new threats related to cross-site attacks applicable to APIs, specifically single sign-on, on-off, that drive single sign-on, and also some kind of tokens, and also WebSockets and different protocols. And the initial idea was to name this like client-side attacks. However, it's not true because APIs ultimately are driven by backends, and many of these issues is not all basically backend stuff. So I decided to keep the cross-site general thing and try to avoid confusion with cross-site scripting by directly pointing, and that's a bit different stuff. To the next slide.
Perfect. So that's the look at the dynamic top 10 that we produce every quarter, and obviously the annual summary of it, as well as the trend data and a few conclusions there. We're going to move on to talk about some of the key findings from the annual report itself, starting with the expanding threat landscape. I don't think anybody's surprised that the threat landscape itself for APIs is expanding. And we're going to start by talking about how there are more API vulnerabilities occurring. So we saw a 30% increase in the number of API vulns compared to a 0.4% increase in the overall number of CVEs. So the point there is that the rate of expansion for API vulnerabilities is faster than the rate of expansion for overall CVEs as well. Also, we've seen that open source vulnerabilities are making up a larger percentage or an increasing percentage of those vulnerabilities that we're seeing. So on the open source side, the share of open source vulnerabilities increased from 64.9% last year, 2022, to 73.6% in 2023. So a growing number of that increasing share of API vulnerabilities is also open source. One point that I wanted to make here about the limitations of this data that's important. We're looking at CVEs, so published known vulnerabilities. That means that this analysis doesn't account for vulnerabilities that don't have a CVE. So a vulnerability in a custom-built web application, something that's not sold commercially, but delivered as a service potentially, wouldn't necessarily have a CVE ID. We won't see that in this analysis. And what that tells me is that the problem here is actually likely larger than what the analysis tells us. There are more API vulnerabilities out there than we can count through just CVEs today. So we see more vulnerabilities. We also see more API attacks occurring. So remember that we have data about attacks that we see in the Wallarm platform. The number or the percentage of malicious requests involving APIs that we blocked has gone up by 16%. Now, this is an important metric to understand, because what we're looking at here is the share of attacks that we see that are targeted at APIs versus other types of web applications. And in 2022, it was roughly 50-50. You can see that from the bar chart there. And in 2023, the split shifted significantly towards APIs. That 16% is really the change, the increase. But what we saw in 2023 was that 70% of the attacks that came across the Wallarm platform were actually targeted at APIs, not web applications. And that's an important shift to note. We've also included some data here about the relationship between the data we see and the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities index. The CISA KEV has become a valuable tool for identifying vulnerabilities that require attention. But we're also seeing that there's a mismatch between the attack activity that we see and what shows up in the CISA KEV. So of our top 10, only 6% showed up there. And if we take a top 100, 33%. If we take the total, 11%. So there's room for improvement. There's a gap. That's not to say that the vulnerabilities in the CISA KEV aren't being exploited, but there is a gap. They're not capturing, obviously, all of the exploited vulnerabilities that exist in the environment today. So more vulnerabilities, more attacks. We're also seeing increased awareness of API security issues in the market today. And I want Ivan to talk about this slide because the methodology that we're using here is particularly interesting. So Ivan, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, and then I also have to add something to the previous slide, because the ability to basically see not only API specific attacks but also all the web attacks allow us to find out where the trend is. Ultimately, we do have year-over-year growth in terms of overall amount of attacks, right? That basically means that definitely attackers getting more and more, running more and more attacks with more requests, but the split between web apps and like vanilla web apps, right, which we sometimes also call the legacy APIs,
legacy APIs,
right? And then that definitely says us a lot, because we see the trend is there, and the trend not only related to CVEs, which is basically vulnerability that issued, right, but also supported by our data, and also supported by bug bounties that we will cover later. So ultimately, this thing is happening now, and API exploits taking like significant part of all this threats for basically all those webs and non-webs resources. To the next slide then.
All right, so back to the API awareness.
Yeah, and then as Tim said before, our job and our main idea why we run in this report is to make better product. To make better product, we have to track threats and ultimately predict risk and predict where the threats goes before it happened on onset just happened, right? And then one of the ideas that we tried this time was related to what if we will get the data related to CVEs just by Googling them, right? By finding amount of pages, index pages with a particular CVE mentioned in Google, and then track this across the time. So since Google now, as Google search is now API driven, and we have a partnership with them, we know how to search fast using their Google API. We know how to track CVEs by amount of mentions, and we see the dynamic, right? And then we can predict even scores like EPSS, right? Or overall score of the software distribution, right? And then we aim to predict cases like Log4j or whatever, once it happened, before actually everyone knows about that and before we have all these exploits. For instance, if something like if some kind of software or library like became vulnerable, it happened with, let's say, very popular software like Confluence a few days ago, we better to track the CVE number hour and get what the dynamic is, and then compare with all the historical dynamics we have collected over the year to find out if the threat basically more popular and more searchable than others during a short period of time, to predict things. And what we find out that now, basically, if we just find out all the top CVs in the Google, right? What we did, we collected all the CVs not related to APIs at all, just all the CVs for the year, right? And we try to search them, how many Google references we do have per each in a year. And then we build a top 20, right? Top 20 CVEs, including everything, a new iOS or Google Chrome, whatever. And we just sort them by amount of Google searches, right? Over the time. Normalized definitely by amount of data. We found that 50% of them, just like almost majority, right? So quorum, right? Related to APIs, which just blow my mind completely. So basically, we only did one simple job, like score all the CVs across the year, right? And then we finding out how many of the top 20 related to APIs. And we got 50%. And my bet was like 12, 10, 8%, but not 50. And we just like, this is probably the most interesting discovery in terms of the statistics and our approach. And I think next quarter, we will improve this to also score particular sources of these websites, right? To find out not only amount of references, but also like how valuable is a particular reference. If it's like the let's say Business Wire, or it's a Bloomberg, or it's an exploit DB, or sources like that, right? Or kind of like other websites. So we definitely have to do that to make kind of like a page rank for them and multiply by that. But the discovery alone very interesting, because we find out that API security is like valuable for an entire cybersecurity landscape if we focus on vulnerabilities over a year in 2023.
Okay, yeah, it's super interesting. I agree. I think it's there's lots of room to improve that measurement function that as we move forward, and it gives a different angle on understanding the vulnerability and threat landscape as well. So we also include in the report information about sort of the most significant API exploits, and we kind of toy with the naming here. Is it significant? We talked about calling these awards, and I think award isn't quite the right term, but let's call them significant for this time period. So we've got 3 exploits that came out that particularly were interesting or surprised us in this case. Ivan, do you want to talk about these?
Sure. Yeah, and again, we definitely can find out more, but we decided to cover just 3 of them because they're all different and very interesting there. The first of them is a API exploit related to the Snapchat that was the most valuable payout for bug bounty. So we also analyzing bug bounty because is it for me, first of all, as a bug hunter and also researcher, now it's one of the most, let's say, clear and, to be honest, fair analysis we can make, because API bug bounty reports or all the bug bounty reports represent the real picture of trend landscape, because it got paid, right? And it's hard to get paid for kind of like unusual or unuseful or impactless thing, right? Most likely higher payouts because it's validated by, in this case, HackerOne, and also validated by the customer, right? In this case, Snapchat, and also validated by a researcher. And the payout related to real threat. And this is not only the most interesting API exploits because it's Snapchat and because it's highly paid, it's like 15K or so just per one thing, but it's also the most, it's the biggest payout for all the bug bounty reports this year, and a bit later we will cover that. The other exploit related to Citrix, that it's called Citrix Bleed, very, very well-known thing. It's the most notable according to Google. So basically, if we just Google for all the CVs and count how many times it was mentioned, you will get Citrix Bleed as number 1. And this is real data, right? It's just like amount of pages that mention the CVE by number in Google. And I assume that Google represent the significant chunk of internet, right? Excluding probably just darknet, right? And then we do have another one thing which I use as a most well-known API exploit, because again, like the most this is the most let's say usual hardware, and then I intentionally put it there to show that API security not only hidden web apps, not only hidden, let's say, world giants driven by APIs like Snapchat, right? Because ultimately you need API if you run in mobile apps, but also enterprise hardware and just some other hardware there, and it's very industrial hardware, which highlighted by CISA for sure, and it's called Open Blue, and it's critical vulnerability. So I put it there to highlight that API security basically everywhere, and on top of that we have NVIDIA graphical cards, AI software, AI hardware with the API software vulnerable, and so many other things like that. And is it for me, it like, look, it just like forget for a second that all these exploits related to APIs, right? You will find out that this 3 particular exploits represent well represent overall threat landscape, right? For all the vulnerabilities from completely different angle. If you want completely different dimensions with completely different stuff with a high risk and also high evidence, and basically a lot of reference from the community that validated this as the most, let's say, the most important stuff. We have basically bug bounty score that ultimately the most valuable bounty in for a year. We do have Google reference, and we do have CISA plus hardware.
Yeah. All right. And so speaking of the bug bounty analysis, let's talk a little bit about the results of that analysis. So this, if you remember back to the methodology I talked about, we collect bug bounty information as part of our overall analysis. So that's the data set that we're working with here. And there are some interesting conclusions. Obviously, you talked about the highest payout being for that Snapchat vulnerability. I mean, I can't help noting immediately that highest payout is much higher in the API column than in the non-API column. So that's one key difference to see. And the total payouts shows the same trend or the same information, that the API-based vulnerabilities on average are getting a higher payout, even for a very similar number of vulnerabilities overall, right, Ivan?
You are right. You are right. And then just in general, right? So API security absolutely dominates bug bounty reports. So, and then the interesting question, right, is why, right? We definitely see the highest payout related to bug bounties, the highest, also almost like 60% highest average payout, right? And then total amount of payouts. And basically it's almost equal by amount of issues. By the way, very similar to the data we see in attacks, which is also well aligned with that. But what's most interesting for me here is, look, the trend is growing. We have more and more API related bug bounty reports and also ultimately threats. But the thing here is, I don't think that somebody will argue that API the bug bounty cannot represent significant chunk of the actual cybersecurity threat landscape, right? First of all, many companies run bug bounties, if not all the big one, right? Second, this data validated multiple times, and payout and average payout definitely represent the risk and score. Even if we count that some of the companies pay less than others, in average, the trend is there, right? And then third thing, it's completely community driven, means that many researchers around the world doing exactly the same thing to find something, and they try to find pretty much everything, right? They're not focusing to find an API security issues. They're trying to do whatever they can, but the fact that they find in specifically API security issues can point, and as it for me essentially point that API security vulnerabilities and threats is a significant one, right? They definitely wondering to find some kind of easy things and accesses, right? Whatever they can, but they get paid only when they find out how to exploit APIs, which is a very interesting result.
Yeah, I mean, it's indicative of the not the threat landscape as much as the technology landscape, right? So the overall target surface for bug bounty, bug hunters is increasingly APIs, which makes sense given the proliferation of APIs that we're seeing as a whole. And as a consequence, you're seeing more bug bounties for APIs. The fact that it's a higher payout, to me, I mean, Ivan, do you think that indicates the organization's like relative value for those types of defects? Is this an economic indicator that we can rely on for determining that API vulnerabilities are more significant?
I mean, I think we definitely can rely on this as one of the key factors, because ultimately, companies who run in bug bounties, they want to pay more for better issues, right? And they score them. They do not obligated to pay anything, right? They only pay when they find it valuable, right? And I really like that it basically passed through many filters, right? And the other thing, and again, like it's so many companies running bug bounties, right? The statistically proven data in terms of like we do have bug bounties available for many companies in the world, right? And the different industries and stuff. But hackers, for some reason, finding valuable issues in their APIs and not somewhere else, right? Definitely, it not includes, let's say, the most powerful 0 days at iPhone, right? And we got this I hope we got this 17.3 update a few days ago, like yesterday. And so, and if you never did that, you have to update your iOS right now. That's a critical 0 day bug exploited in the wild. And then it's not, I mean, the thing here as API security is a part of the threat landscape, and then it's significant part of that threat landscape, and it's confirmed by amount of issues, amount of attacks that we see, and also bug bounty reports. So I don't think that it might be wrong if 3 different sources with completely different approaches, right, how to validate data, confirm the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that brings us out of the bug bounty section into API leaks as a key finding. Before I dive into this, just one reminder: if you have questions, feel free to put them in the comments on LinkedIn. If you're on the Zoom, feel free to put them into the Q&A section. We'll see what time we have left for questions, but feel free to add them in, and as we go, we'll try and address them. So API leaks, one of the significant findings that came out of Q3 and then continued into Q4, so is now a big part of the annual report, is around API leaks. So what are we talking about here? Because I had one conversation with someone, I was talking about API leak detection, and they really thought I was talking about more like a DLP kind of function. But really, what we're talking about is the relationship between the change in the technology stack, the tools that developers and applications themselves are using, and the potential for sensitive data to migrate into those tools and then be leaked in ways that they're not meant to. So that could be, an obvious example is an API key, right? If you find a key that should be private and it's leaked in a repository somewhere, that's a big deal. But these also include other types of credentials, could be a private schema, could be things like user information and file location. So there's all kinds of data that might come out of these leaks. And it could be the API itself that's leaking that information. All of that ultimately leads to unauthorized access or the potential for unauthorized access. So when we're talking about API leaks, that's the threat that we're talking about: sensitive data getting, being exposed outside of your infrastructure to potential attackers as well.
Yeah,
so let's talk a little bit. Yeah, go ahead, Ivan. You want to add to that?
Just let me add something, right? Why? I used to run like research in physics, then I switched to cyber. But all the time when you're a researcher you research something, right? Your ultimate goal and the most excitement thing they can do to find something new, right? And when you find something new, you definitely you feel like you did a good job. But what's most interesting there is when you find something new that was obvious and never uncovered before, you get even more excited. So API security leaks exactly the same. So we just analyze real exploits, real data, real threats, and even data breaches and incidents, and find out that leaks is definitely like something that happening. And leaks actually, specifically API leak, they're valuable because we see and we saw and we continue to see many new sources of those leaks where we find out API keys or API schemas or API different other API credentials or even responses with sensitive data, and it's basically made me really excited related to what we did and why we analyzing these threats, because the things, they're available, they're real, they exist, and they're uncovered, and it's kind of like validated by so many sources we analyzed.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've done is categorize the leaks that we found. So this is a full year's worth of data. We showed Some similar data in Q3, although I think it was a pie chart instead of the bar chart, but same concept, right? What kinds of leaks are we seeing in, sort of what quantity in CVEs in this case? So you can see, authenticated data exposure is at the top. So, you're authenticated to a system and it's exposing data. Unauthenticated data disclosure is number 2. And then it sort of flows down from there. Sensitive information leaked via an error message, a file disclosure, credential and session exposure, API key exposure, and then we get into some single digits with some enumeration and logging of sensitive data at the bottom there. So these are the types of API leaks that we're seeing, and it's always good to look at categories in data, but it's also good to look at some specific examples so that we understand a little bit about what we're talking about. So these are 3 examples I pulled from Q4, if I remember correctly, just to explain what we're talking about here. So we've got, an issue with Grafana that was assigned to CVE, where Grafana, they introduced a new capability so that you could use a JWT in a query parameter, but in certain configurations that allows the results of that query parameter, which would be a token, to be sent to third-party data sources. And if somebody has access to those data sources, they then have that token. So this was given a CVSS base score of 7.5, but you can see how it's a leak of a token. You'd have to be authenticated to run the query, so it falls into that first category, but it would expose that token to third parties.
Yeah, and it's basically a very interesting thing though, because when we're talking about leaks and you see why it's new for APIs, you know, hey, did you ever see something like this with web apps, right? With GVT and the tokens leaks and whatever. No, the GVT tokens introduced specifically for APIs, and the way how they used here is like only related to APIs, and like there is absolutely nothing else that works like this when you actually can search for your own key and you find out some other key.
Yeah, exactly. So the second one, I like this Veracode example because it's actually an integration. And when we talk about APIs, we're often talking about integration. So this is the Veracode scan Jenkins plugin, which invokes a Java API wrapper in a way that allows local users. So here we've got a lower CVSS base score because you have to have OS level access to Jenkins to find, but it basically gives you the ability to find the Veracode API credentials. So there's a leak there of credentials. And then the last one is from Siemens. Again, a relatively high base score. This is an interesting one because it fits into that sort of industrial space. And this is basically an accessible REST API endpoint without authentication. So there's a vulnerability there, and it allows attackers to download files. So the exposure here, the leak is file data in this case. So 3 examples of API leaks. And you saw on the trend chart, the one I said was my favorite slide in the deck, how API leaks had grown over the year in terms of in terms of count in the data that we have as well. So a few examples there. So there are some challenges with remediating leaks that we thought were worth bringing up. This is actually the same slide we had in Q3 because these challenges haven't changed since Q3, since we did the Q3 analysis. When you're looking to address API leaks, there are challenges with the dependency chains that are complex. The more we have applications that are distributed into microservices, distributed across multiple containers, potentially distributed across multiple vendors when there are partners involved, it becomes really difficult to track the root cause of a particular leak in some cases. Legacy systems complicate these challenges as well. Especially when they're integrated into more modern systems, you have that complexity. Of course, we know that organizations lack visibility into their API landscape as a whole. That's part of the reason that the API security industry exists. And without that visibility, it's very difficult to track down root causes and change them as well. The speed of development is an interesting challenge here as well, because the faster we're pushing code, and we do push code faster and faster to production, the more likely you are to see changes, the more difficult it is to track down a specific change that caused a leak as well. And of course, everybody's constrained in terms of resources. So, in many cases, if an API leak isn't known, then of course you're not going to spend any resources on it. Once it's known, finding the resources to address it is always a challenge as well. Was there anything you wanted to add to this slide, Ivan?
Yeah, I can't agree more. Was the statement, the last statement that you put here related to the a leak as a threat, right? When you don't have it in your threat landscape, right, and risk landscape, it's even hard to prioritize those issues because you don't even know what's there and how to mitigate that. That's why we're pushing that things very fast, almost in real time, and try to align real threats with a real risk scoring faster than one time in 4 years as OWASP, right? To tell them, hey guys, here is a leak. If the leak had happened, it most likely very critical, and you have to focus on that, and then you have to investigate it, right? And next time when we will run that, we also will produce a kind of methodology how to mitigate API risk, how to run risk scoring, how to run security investigation, which kind of steps should be done, right? Because ultimately, cybersecurity experts and CISOs and overall practitioners, they had some issues with like prioritizing API leaks and also risk scoring for them, and definitely remediation risk just because of that. So I think that since the threat is new, all the methodologies and stuff related that should be also new and built specifically for the threat. That's, I think, what we have to focus based on what I said that slide.
Okay. So we're at the end of our analysis. I always like to wrap up the analysis with sort of key takeaways. What are 3 things that we think you should take away from this analysis itself? First of all, it's clear that APIs are the new threat landscape. All of the data and evidence suggests that that's what we're headed towards. That's the truth of 2024 and beyond. Is that we as an information security industry need to focus on securing APIs and the data that passes through them. Also, it's clear that organizations really have to focus on protecting all of their APIs. And this is a point that I think is really important. To date, web application security and API security have been sort of seen as the purview of application security or AppSec. But that ignores the API security issues that occur in commercial off-the-shelf products, in open source products that are integrated into your environment. There are APIs out there that are outside of what AppSec would consider their responsibility today. This is part of the reason that there's a rise in the function of product security as well. So this is a space that I think needs attention. And then finally, the protection that you have to apply goes beyond your own infrastructure. We just talked about API leaks. API leaks are not necessarily in an application that you have direct control over. They're not necessarily in your code. The ability to address them in outside sources like Postman collections is a critical and becoming a critical component of API security as a whole. So with that, we can look forward to what's coming in the future with some API security predictions. That was the past. This is the future. Let's talk a little bit about where we think things are going, Ivan. Certainly, I think API is becoming a primary attack vector. The data shows that. I'd almost argue that this is true today, although I think there's going to be increasing growth as well. What do you think?
I mean, I can't agree more. And again, like I'm very confident in that because, guys, we analyzed we analyze data with 3 different approaches, right? The bug bounty is a kind of like financial metric, right? It's basically real money that somebody appointed, right, to them. We analyze on statistics based on the CVSS numbers. We applied AI to get like how this threats actually evolution during time. And we do have some real evidence from real incidents that actually happened, like data breaches, and all of them support the same thing. So I definitely can't agree more, and it's already happened.
Yeah. And the same thing with API leaks becoming a top threat. We just talked about that. I think it's currently number 4 in our top 10. It's not really covered in the OWASP top 10 for APIs, but it's clear that it's a threat, and we think it'll become a top threat in 2024 as well. We've seen open source API vulnerabilities growing. I think a safe prediction is that they're going to continue growing. We'll see the share of overall vulnerabilities, open source vulnerabilities, shifting towards APIs even further. The last one of API attacks becoming more sophisticated. This is an interesting one because we have a tendency in this industry to call every attack sophisticated, but the reality is that there are attacks that are sophisticated and aren't. An API vulnerability that we just talked about with Siemens, an unauthenticated REST API that gives you information. That's not a sophisticated vulnerability or a sophisticated attack. But the more connections we see between APIs, the more likely we are to see sophisticated, difficult to address, difficult to understand attacks against APIs showing up. And then there are a couple additional predictions we had here. The continued growth in API vulnerabilities, all the evidence points to API vulnerabilities continuing to grow. That 30% growth number we talked about is going to increase. One item we didn't talk about, but we think is a clear prediction, is the persistent exploitation of Log4j. Ivan, do you want to talk a little bit about what we saw with Log4j in 2023 and where we think it's headed?
We definitely, first of all, we see this, we see the consistent threat of Log4j, not because, I mean, not only because it's a kind of like the well-known attack, but mainly because the customers and many of this libraries still not updated, right? That's why we do have that. So attackers still have a high chance to get a successful Log4j exploit. And the reason of that, because it's so sometimes, specifically when we're talking about hardware, the library is basically so deep inside. It's hard to find out that the library even exists there. And if you're talking about enterprise software, I mean, I don't think that we even know what's the Java percentage there, but it's definitely majority, right? And the Java is there. We're talking about Java even 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, not to say about libraries like Log4j, which is essentially a part of the Java stack from early beginning, right? The Log4j itself, Log4j is a heart of Java, right? It's hard to find out that any Java app works without that stuff, without that library. And the library is vulnerable by default, and this default actually spread there across the world. So I think that we will see Log4j as a main threat, as a #1 exploit next year as well, or we will see it in top 5, top 10 next year for sure. But again, essential problems are when we're talking about Log4j, it's essentially equal to Java itself, right? It's not like third-party libraries nobody use. It's third-party library just a few people never use, but mainly it's almost the same as Java. So finding issues in Log4j as a library is almost equal to find out the issue in the Java core. That's why it's on the top, right?
Excellent. So we also expect to see increased prevalence of broken access and authentication, as we talked about in the dynamic top 10. And then last but not least, we expect this metric for vulnerability triaging of Google popularity that we talked about to increase in adoption as well. We think it's a pretty powerful metric for addressing awareness and helping to prioritize issues as well. Yeah. And that brings us to the end of the security predictions. I'm going to spend a little bit of time, just 3 slides, talking about how Wallarm can help with these situations, with these challenges. So we're shifting from the data to the product a little bit. While I talk about it, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the comments. Feel free to put them in the Q&A if you're in Zoom. So Wallarm offers today a platform for integrated API and application security. We're focused on 3 core capabilities. First of all, we have our cloud-native web application and API protection that is focused on detecting and blocking attacks. We have advanced API security, which is focused on identifying your API threat environment with API discovery and preventing more sophisticated API attacks. And then finally, we have API attack surface management, which is focused on discovering your external public API threat landscape, including API leak detection as well. All of that is built on top of an integrated platform that provides a basic set of capabilities, things like integration, things like flexible deployments and rate limiting, lots of great capabilities in there for customers. The basic philosophy behind those technical capabilities is this end-to-end approach, helping customers discover what they have in their environment for APIs and applications, protect those discovered entities with the cloud-native web application and API protection, looking at traffic, blocking attacks, help customers respond to the attacks and events that occur in their environment with details and integrations, and then finally round out the capabilities with testing so that you can identify vulnerabilities and reduce risk before you're attacked as well. And then finally, I wanted to mention API leak detection in particular. This is a relatively new capability that we introduced as part of our API attack surface management capability. We announced this back at Black Hat Europe in December. Our API leak detection scans external repositories, things like Postman collections, also your web application itself, looking to detect and discover leaked keys and secrets. We help you identify those and remediate them with information. And then if you also have the cloud native web application and API protection, you can generate virtual patches to block the use of those leaked credentials in traffic as well. So some pretty interesting capabilities around API leak detection in the product today. Of course, there's a full report for you to download. So if you thought the information that we talked about today was interesting, you can go to wallarm.com/resources and pull down the full report so that you have all of those nifty graphics and statistics at your fingertips as you might like. Lots of great information in there. A few things that we didn't cover, although we certainly hit the highlights in this session as well. And if you're interested in our next webinar, you can sign up for that now. We'll be hosting this webinar with Howard Holton, the CTO of GigaOM, talking about the state of API security. Should be pretty exciting. That's February 14th. We're really excited to have that webinar and have Howard on as well. So I'm going to take. Sorry, go ahead, Ivan.
Valentine's Day.
On Valentine's Day. What better way to spend Valentine's Day than with API security?
With 3 of us.
Right. So let's just see. There are a couple of questions I think that we can answer. One question that popped up here was, why are weak secrets in cryptography only API problems? Can you explain? I think this was a question that came up in the top 10 section. And I think the answer there is that they're not. We obviously, we pulled out the information specifically for API data, API vulnerabilities. So our analysis separated the API conditions up front, and then within that set of API vulnerabilities, we found weak secrets in cryptography fell into the ranking where they were.
Correct. Yes, yeah. This is correct.
Perfect.
And the other question was related to is BOLA the same as IDOR? Yeah, so that's really fancy, but essentially BOLA is just renamed IDOR. That happened with OWASP API security top 10, but it's exactly equal to IDOR.
Yeah, great. Okay, good. I don't see any additional questions in LinkedIn or in the Zoom chat. So I think we've answered the questions. In that case, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. I hope the session was interesting. I think as we put together this deck, I thought the data was super interesting, and I like the conclusions. They're pretty interesting as well. So thank you for spending time with us, and thank you, Ivan, for joining us to present the results. Always valuable to have your insight as well.
And I also have to thank for this research for an entire team of Wallarm, because I definitely was never alone, and we did this research year over year, and it's basically our third year in a row while we're doing this. Thanks everyone who participated and an entire Wallarm team for the contribution to the report, and including visualization and UI and then the graphic design and also infographics there. Thanks everyone, and special thanks for the product team who made this feature work. And then we now have this protection for API leaks in a full cycle, including detection and monitoring, and also protection, which is the most important part. Because I mean, it's one thing to detect something, and the completely different thing is to provide the solution that actually can help to mitigate the threat right here, right now, and don't wait until next release or next 4 years.
All right, great. I echo that. Thanks to everyone who was involved. And thanks to everyone who participated. So if you have questions or would like us to follow up, feel free to reach out. We're easy to find. You can comment on the LinkedIn stream or in Zoom, and we're happy to follow up with you, of course.
Yeah, don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn, and also go to wallarm.com/resources to download the report copy.